Teddy? Yes, darling. Do you have something to say? Oh, I'm sorry. Can you say that again so we can see? Have you? Can you sit up, please? Oh, good boy. Well done. And so, welcome to Pet Talk with me, Teddy, with me, Anna, and Teddy. And of course, our wonderful guest today, who is Roz Pooley. Hello, Roz.
Hiya, how are you?
I am very well. Now, I wanted to invite you on because you were not long ago doing what seems to me a wonderful seminar about rehoming street dogs. So, and I know that, you know, it's very different rehoming a street dog to rehoming a dog that's already used to being in a home. So I thought it might be nice if you could talk to us a little bit about that today.
Yeah, sure, not a problem. Absolutely. Did you want to fire away some questions or?
So tell us about your experience then of dealing with street dogs.
Sure. So it started off, oh gosh, I don't know how long ago it was now, because I think, well, it's as long as I've had Kanita actually. So just over 10 years ago, I became aware of the dog meat trade in Thailand. And I was already aware of some dogs coming over to the UK from Romania. And there's this rescue sort of crisis about the dog meat trade in Thailand. And I donated to the cause, and that didn't feel like enough. And before I knew it, I was signing up for a dog from Thailand, and we chose Kanita. And a few months later, she came over from Thailand, and she's been in my life ever since. And so living with a street dog was a sort of really steep learning curve. And back then it was just as sort of foreign rescue dogs or street dogs were starting to just take off, but not really to the prevalence that it was today. They were still somewhat unusual. And the charity that I got Kanita from saw that I was involved with behaviour and asked me and a friend of mine to become involved in advising them. So that's how I kind of got initially started with advising on street dogs. And then as they started to increase in popularity, I think obviously not many of us professionals in Bristol have street dogs, so a lot of people were coming to me for my input. So I do see a lot of street dogs for my, with my behaviour work as well. And it's just gone from there really, where I think Kanita's taught me a lot, and so I offer a different perspective on street dogs that perhaps some people don't have the privilege of learning through living with them.
So yes, excuse me, you are actually the second guest that I've had on who's rescued a dog from the meat trade. And so, you know, this is obviously a hugely emotive subject. And in fact, rescuing is a very emotive subject anyway.
Yeah, sure.
And we have that urge immediately, you know, to coddle and cuddle. And that's actually not necessarily the right way to start when you bring your street dog home. So what do people need to keep in mind when they are embarking on?
Excuse me, I'm embarking. So yeah, when they're embarking on getting a rescue dog, I think obviously in a way, I'm not sure if it matters where the dog's from, whether it's a puppy or a rescue dog. We actually need to look at the dog as an individual, but to look at them with open eyes rather than seeing what perhaps we might want to see. So, you know, if obviously we know that a dog that's coming from a potentially traumatic experience or past is going to have there's going to be a higher chance that that dog is not going to be so forthcoming in wanting affection, especially if they have an absence of socialization in their past as well. Whereas obviously one would hope that a well-bred puppy would be quite happy to be handled by someone. But nonetheless, I'm a strong advocate in, that it doesn't matter where the dogs come from, we should be responding to the individual's behavior. And it just so happens that these dogs, when they touch base on UK soil, they are very frequently traumatised, and some of them will seek comfort via tactile contact and others won't, and they might be incredibly shut down. And I think this is what potential adopters and owners need to be aware of, is what shut down can look like. I always describe it as an absence of affiliative behaviour. Affiliative meaning bendy body or some sort of acknowledgement, whether that's the ears kind of moving a little bit or the tail even going a little. If it's just kind of quite still and withdrawn, these are the dogs that might need a little bit more sort of space and time initially. And the safest way is that anyone, if we interact or offer an interaction, we let the dog complete the sequence rather than always moving into their space as well. So that would be my, advice with anyone getting these dogs, is to bear in mind what they've gone through. They don't come sort of, predisposed to loving people. We don't really know their social history. And some of them, have minimal socialization and take to their lives very easily. And others have been socialized, but so traumatized that, they have to start afresh. So we just have to look at the individual and give them the time that they need based on the behaviors that they show us.
I think what strikes me is that it's about trust, and they have no reason to trust you whatsoever. And in fact, they may have many reasons not to trust you. And so we need to be extremely gentle and allow them to discover that they are safe. And by pushing, we are not going to be helping them to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's all about invitations and consent. We talk about so much about consent in people and how important it is. But what about with animals? And I think we can invite. And of course, there's going to be instances where we have to do something. For instance, if you're picking up a rescue dog from a van, we can't, we have to move them into our transport, so into our home. It probably, for some against their will, but once they're in a place of safety, it's really about doing things on their terms. And sometimes, it's okay to invite. We have to just be very sort of careful about how we invite and not putting them under too much pressure. And then it depends on the individual.
So what does pressure look like? When we say putting them under pressure, I can just see it, I'm only trying to. Yeah. So let's be very clear about what constitutes pressure.
Absolutely. Let's get sort of descriptive, because pressure is just it's a very broad umbrella term that might look very different to different people. I would suggest, from a sort of behavioral perspective, when behaviors humans can do that can put dogs under pressure is sort of offering treats even from the hand, even throwing food at a dog. If the dog's not even yet in the right place to take food off the ground, then having food thrown at them can put them under pressure. Trying to coax them over, even if being gentle, or even just talking at them a lot, it doesn't matter how discreet and gentle we're trying to be. Pressure is down to the perceptions of the individual. And if an individual is sort of not really engaging and is doing everything they can to move away, then actually any movement into that individual's space, even if the intentions are good, may put them under pressure. And, we need them to give us a signal, whether that's perhaps looking with a bit more of a sort of, open eye and not quite so sort of stressed looking, or angling their face towards us, some signal that suggests they're ready to take some information from us, is then we can respond. But again, we have to do it very carefully, and to not go in too quickly.
So I guess the thing to do is to watch the dog, because if the dog is deliberately moving away or turning away, we need to immediately respect that. Yeah. And really what we're saying then is that putting pressure on them is having an expectation of them, however small that expectation might be. Just the attempt to make contact. And it could be as simple as eye contact, couldn't it? Because eye contact could be interpreted by the dog as threat.
Mm. It's kind of like pushing for an interaction when there's no invitation of it being ready to be received. You know, so if they are literally sort of, and bearing in mind, often they're trying to move away, but actually they will reach their capacity because of the four walls that contain them. So they're going to reach a capacity as to how far they can go. And so, yeah, I think pressure really is, you know, sort of defined by that uninitiated, you know, contact or interaction. And, you know, where we're kind of doing it with a goal in mind, and, you know, it's trying to, rather than, and taking away control, you know, we're trying to hurry the process. Whereas actually, if we waited for some sort of information from the dog that suggested they're ready for a dialogue of some kind, or at least some information gathering at some level, which may be very, very small, then it's okay to send them some information. We just, you know, have to be very careful about how we do that. So that's, yeah, absolutely how I would define it, is looking at the individual. And if there's no soliciting of, you know, communication going on, I think we do need to be giving a dog in those circumstances the space that they need, because they're going to be very stressed.
Well, you know, listening to you put me in mind of my mother. Now, my mother was very phobic of cats. And this is after I had moved out. My brother found a cat who desperately needed a home. It was a friend. It had been attacked by the household dog, and it really wasn't safe there. So he brought it home. He said to Mum, you know, we have to help this cat. And my mum said, as long as I don't have to see her. Mm-hmm. And the cat went into the basement, and, you know, food was delivered, water, you know, my brother was out most of the time. And of course, my mother being my mother, it couldn't bear the thought of this cat, no matter how phobic she was. So every so often she'd just go down and have a look, check it was okay, and come back out. This is exactly what the cat needed. She needed huge amounts of space and time to come out of her shell and say, oh, okay, I'm safe here. And it was precisely because she was left alone in the basement for a while. She was able to come out and trust, and of course she and my mother became inseparable.
Oh, pretty sweet.
But, you know, by accident.
Yeah.
What she
got on both of their terms, like the cat wasn't jumping on her lap, forcing her past her threshold of tolerance, and then the cat was also not forced past theirs. So it sounds like they kind of developed a relationship on, you know, with equal control.
Exactly.
Yeah, and obviously there's always going to be an imbalance of control with a dog-human relationship, because, you know, and we can't give dogs full control, but we can certainly try to give them as much as possible, especially when it comes to, you know, and moving into their personal space. And as you mentioned, trust is earned and relationships are built. They don't come pre-installed. And yes, obviously domesticated dogs, one would hope, would have some sort of you know, predisposition to want to sort of potentially be around people, but we have to bear in mind the past that these dogs have gone through, and not all of them. Some of them haven't been abused, or but yeah, you know, no dog comes, you know, ready to go, so to speak. It's, I think, all relationships with all animals have to be built up carefully.
Well, you know, there is the other fact as well, is that some of them may actually not be used to being indoors.
No, and it is unfortunately, you know, the case with many of these dogs, that they've, you know, especially when they're adults, so they've actually had a long life, very different to that. And it's small little things that we probably don't, we're habituated to, like we don't really pick up on, you know, electricity in the walls, or the sounds of the fridge, or, you know, the little weird sort of glitchy sound the TV makes when you turn it on. All of these things are totally different to those dogs. The sense of household, so like, you know, the cleaning products that people might use, I personally use very gentle ones for that reason. But yeah, there's so many things that these dogs are just not prepared for. And obviously they've also just had a life generally. I imagine if they're from, you know, a shelter, like most of these shelters overseas, where there's not really a huge amount of structure, and they are largely left to, I say, their own devices in terms of, you know, they're not, it depends on the shelter, but they're not used to the structure that a family life brings, and they're around other dogs and interacting with them. And so all of a sudden they find themselves in many situations as an only dog in an environment they've got no history of being in. And that's, I don't know if we will ever fully understand what that's like for these dogs, especially after the journey they go through.
Indeed. And of course, if they have been on the street before going into the shelter, again, they've had, well, let's put it this way, however tough life might have been, they were extremely free to do whatever they liked.
Exactly, yeah. So as you so rightly said, you know, if they pre-shelter, and some of them actually get pulled off the streets and actually aren't in shelter for very long. So if they are a genuine street dog, which I think is in ways getting less, because actually we seem to be getting so many more dogs that are raised from a shelter environment, which is probably why my brain went down that route more. Back in the day when I first started working with them, there was way more dogs coming off the street. Now it seems to be they're more often from a shelter environment and live there for quite a long time. But yes, if they're on the street, yeah, they might have to dodge people to keep themselves safe. They might have to be a little bit aware of what other dogs are up to. Are they going to come over and, is there going to be a contest over resources and that sort of thing? But yes, these dogs have a lot of freedom to do their species specific behaviors within the ability that the environment can provide. And then all of a sudden, all of that's taken away and they're being expected to walk on a lead and, you know, walk when told, walk at the pace they're told, and, you know, in the environment that's chosen for them. And it must be very strange for them.
Yes, indeed. I had a question and it's gone.
Oh no, sorry, I probably talked too much.
It was, what was it you were talking about just before that? Shelter life. No, it's completely gone. So it was
back.
It was back. Yes, I was.
Just me to remember what I was talking about. I definitely won't remember what I said a couple of minutes ago, let alone.
No, I guess what's also on my mind is that in a heath not far from us where we walk, there's a poster up from a dog that's been lost on the heath, recently rescued. And I seem to come across that sadly too frequently. Yeah. So yes, the question I have is, when we rescue a dog, how do we prepare for off-lead walks?
Yeah.
How do we get that recall? What, is there a time that we're looking for in terms of the dog's behavior?
Or a behavioral marker? Yeah.
Yes, that's what I'm.
Yeah, and that's such a good question. I think what I will say just to sort of about these dogs that go missing, we see it a lot as well, is very common frequently it's actually because the dog slipped a collar. So anyone who's getting a street dog, especially dogs that show any kind of backup or aversion or avoidance behavior, these are the dogs that back out of equipment. So when dogs are more avoidance type behaviors, they're the ones that are going to try and back up and slip things, whereas dogs that are reacting by lunging and barking, they're moving into equipment more often than not. That said, you can't be a well-fitted escape-proof harness for these dogs. So please get your dogs fitted into a harness, and you need that for recall training anyway. So that's going to lead me on to your actual question. It's sensible to have dogs on long lines until we've got an established recall. And I think for a lot of street dogs, not all, but a lot of street dogs will have quite a lot of predatory behaviors. And it's not so much that actually free-ranging dogs don't actually hunt that much because they just forage, but actually I think once they're in they've got high levels of energy due to being fed frequently, they often do have very, very high prey drives, including how they play with dogs, but how they operate on walk environments. So a long line is really good. And it may be for a lot of these street dogs, there are only certain places they can be let off safely. So for my dog, Kanita, I've had her 10 years. There are some environments I will not let her off. If there's any concern of livestock within a 2-3 mile radius, I probably am not going to do it. Not because she goes that far. I just don't want to risk her getting the scent of them. And, you know, so there's certain environments that work for us, and the rest of the time she's on a long line. And so it may be that owners start off that way. Okay, I've got quite a reliable recall on a long line. Maybe you start to drop the long line in a certain environment that's less predatory, and your dog seems most responsive and relaxed in. And then if that's reliable, maybe you put them on a slightly lighter weight long line, so you get an idea of how they respond with a bit more freedom. And then perhaps you start to let them off lead altogether in those areas. I admire the people in ways who are brave enough to let a street dog off everywhere, and part of me is probably quite jealous as well. But for some, it's, you know, we must always remind ourselves we should have our dogs within sight of us. You know, if they're in the woodland, they might go out of sight briefly, but you should see them quickly as well. So I think, you know, it's important with any dog, street dog or not, that before they are let off lead, we have evidence of a good recall when on a long line, and that we don't just let them off and hope for the best, especially if they are, you know, nervous.
I can't recommend long lines enough.
No.
Because obviously Teddy, you know, arrived as a puppy, so I didn't have the same issues, but I did have an extremely excitable puppy when he was outdoors, who, you know, for a dog who has who never wants to be away from me for 5 minutes, when he was outside, he easily forgot me.
Yes.
And would go off no matter, you know, I used to carry cooked liver with me, and he still would, you know, run off if he could. And just because he was so excited, and you know, people, I didn't even have the luxury, you know, of that puppy time where they want to stay close to you. No, he was off, you know.
I get that puppy time. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, he was so excited to be off, and he was so center driven that, you know, nothing mattered except the excitement of the moment. And so we got a long lead, and I think it took, I started to let him off properly when he was about 1. So it was after he was 1. I know it was
sticking
with 1.
It.
He was 13 months when I let that lead off for the first time, and then under certain circumstances, but it was 18 months when I put it away.
Wow. And good for you for being so responsible, though, because it is, I totally get why people want to be, you know, I've been holding on to a long line intermittently for 10 years.
And
it's all in the technique. Once you get a good technique, they can become so much easier. And that's why I take Kanita to locations where she can go off lead. So I get my respite, and then I don't begrudge the long line as much when I'm in another environment. But having a very good long line technique does make it easier. And good for you for keeping him on, you know, working on that recall, because it is the right thing to do. Is it easy? No, but it's the right thing to do.
I think the recall was there by about 11 months. But what used to worry me was the way he was so enthusiastic and going up to every single dog.
Yeah.
I had no way of teaching him that that's not always a safe thing to do. In fact, it's not the polite thing to do. For, you know, it took him a while to get those social skills. And so I had, excuse me, I had him on the long lead until I was confident that he was going to be behaving.
Read the room. Yeah, someone said that on their behaviour reports. I'm not sure my dog reads the room. I love that saying. But it's really important that they go, you know, they go into situations sensibly. And I think I'm very fortunate with my young adolescent dog. I'm not sure if he was just digging at his bed a moment ago, if you heard, wondered what that noise was, but he's actually very sensible in how, I think that's what comes with living with a street dog. If you live with a street dog, you soon learn manners. So yeah, Kanita's taught him some wonderful social skills, and now she fancies the pants off him. So because she seems to think she's got breeding rights despite being neutered. So yes, that's street dogs for you. Very primitive.
And you know, it's just wonderful, isn't it? It's so I guess what we're saying is, where the recall is concerned, yet again, read your dog, go with the dog, and you know that the dropping of the line, as you said, we did that I think we did that from about 6 months, 5 months. We were drawing the line, but and consequently we were always filthy because the
Yeah, pretty muddy. Yeah.
but it was wonderful because it gave him the opportunity to have some freedom,
It's
and it
true.
gave us the opportunity to have some control, because if he was about to take off, I could grab that lead quite quickly.
Yeah.
So
And
yes.
it's really important. I say that freedom is so important. If dogs, there's no comparison between a long line and a short lead. I think dogs need to be able to move under their own agency to an extent, moving at a trot if they want. If most dogs will choose a trot, apart from obviously some the bigger breeds might walk a little bit, but a lot of dogs do tend to trot even if it's a slower gait from sniff to sniff. Yeah, I think it's really important that we give them that freedom. But there's also something to be said for changing the weight of the long line. Dogs can tell the difference between being on a heavy long line, and that inhibits behavior far more than a light long line. So I do always say to people, part of the recall process or proofing it is to change the weight of the lead as well.
I like that. That's a really great tip. I wouldn't have known that.
No, I don't think it gets talked
really
about
nice.
very often. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I've not really heard it be said anywhere. I think it's a stage of recall training that possibly gets a little bit too frequently overlooked.
Yeah, no, I do remember that when I first took the lead off him, actually we were with a group of friends, all with dogs that had kind of grown up together, and there was a great cheer as the lead came off for the very it was very fitting that we were all together, and I do remember that he looked so happy.
Yeah.
He had just that extra little bounce, in
heavy. Like long lines are heavy. Like that's the thing is, and also it causes a slight imbalance in movement. So actually to be able to move under your full control, and that's why secure fields are great as well. Get a measure of your dog's recall in secure field, but we have to recognize it's a limited environment. Just because the dog responds in a secure field, it doesn't mean they will when there's a lot more sort of in a more dynamic environment that's got a lot more changes going on. From what other people and individuals bring into it.
So let's say that you've got your street dog and you're not yet confident, you're using the long lead, but you have access to a secure field. So what would you recommend? Are there any activities, fun activities that people could do with their dogs in an enclosed field?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. If we're talking street dogs, it depends, because you get some street dogs that are really up for playing with toys, and they're so varied. I've got the primitive street dog that does. It's got to be her idea, and it's only optimum for the time it's optimum for her. So like you might get one rep, you might get no reps of something. She's very much, does what she wants when she wants. And thankfully now, most of the time she wants to hang out with me. So she's quite controllable on walks. If you have quite a motivated street dog, I mean, the first thing to do with any street dog is let them feel safe in the environment. They're not going to play or interact with you until they've scoped out their environment. Most of them are quite primitive in that sense. They need to look around and check that they're safe, and not just look, sniff, and just generally sort of get a scope of the environment. You can then, it really depends on the dog, and it's not going to be overly dissimilar to any other dog. You could do little bits of training, you could do tug recall games or sort of self-control games. You could do some tracking with some dogs if the secure field's big enough, search games. It's all about playing to the dog's strength, looking at what sort of things does your dog favor, sway to. Do they like having things in their mouth and tugging? Do they prefer using their nose and tracking? I mean, all dogs do track, but some will really track more than others. Do they, if they're more visual, perhaps doing some sort of, games that involve a little bit of movement. It really depends on the dog. And again, it's all about reading the dog, isn't it, in front of you, and playing sort of to their strengths as well. So it's a tough one to sort of give a default thing. But anything that's available out there as, fun and games for all dogs it applies to some street dogs as well. So maybe not all, definitely not Kanita.
Well, I think, as always, it seems in every conversation that I have on Pet Talk, it always comes down to this: watch your dog,
Yeah.
learn from your dog, move at your dog's pace, and and that way you build trust, and from that, everything follows. And it seems that it's so much more important when we're dealing with dogs who have had difficult pasts. So thank you very much,
Oh,
Roz,
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
for being with us today.
That's my absolute pleasure. I very much appreciate the invite. Talking about street dogs is one of my favorite things. So
Now, if people wanted to know more about your work, where could they find you?
sure. So they can find me on Facebook. So the business name is The Mutti Professor. On Facebook, I'll often do some little sort of video discussion, or training. You'll sometimes get little training demos, or I write some blogs. It really depends on my mood and what's going on that week and how well my dogs are behaving on walks as well. So if the walks, I should say, they're always generally very well behaved. If the walks are more quiet, I can do a little video as well. So there's all sorts of content on there. You even get to see my street dog listening to me singing in the car as part of fun, silly stuff like dog carpool karaoke. But we also have blogs on our website, which is themuttyprofessor.co.uk, and you can learn a bit more about me and my experience and qualifications there too.
Wonderful. Roz, once again, thank you so much. And I'll be sure to have a link on the description box for you.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for watching. And I think next time we are going to be looking at itchy skin in the company of a wonderful vet, Pete Wedderburn. Until then, goodbye.